And US-India trade deal isn't necessarily the holy grail, is it, Trin? Because Prime Minister Modi, he's been hedging his bets, he's been diversifying trade partnerships and consolidating and building on existing ones. India already has a trade deal with the UK and the EU more or less in the bag. There's the GCC economic corridor, doubling down on the BRICS partnership, although India did call out China on rare earth minerals. But the issue is, when is all of this going to translate into an FDI windfall and inflows and economic tailwinds? Is it going to be a matter of years before we see that?
Fundamentally, it's the EU and the US that are key markets for India, especially the developed Asian markets. If you look at India versus China, India struggles to export to China. In the top 10 items, most of them, it exports like zero, right? Whereas it has a huge import bill. So BRICS, while in practice sounds nice, a lot of these guys are basically have similar comparative advantages. And China being, with deflated PPI, can export so much more competitive with subsidies. So for India, looking at developing and competing, it needs to secure the EU FTA. As mentioned, the EU is a huge market. The EU also needs India to succeed. It's not seeing India as a strategic competitor. So India can gain much more export. And the US is one where it can gain much more for the reshuffling out of China, which is accelerating at rapid speed, right?
It is.
So I do think the Modi government has a lot to lose by being complacent. And I think it is a very delicate balance, but it needs to push through these deals.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. So where do you think India is in developing its own China plus one strategy in tech manufacturing, which, of course, fits quite neatly into Prime Minister Modi's narrative of a Make in India policy? Apple, Tesla, Samsung, they have committed, but is that scalable?
Absolutely. What India has is people. It has the size to run hundreds of thousands of people in a factory. You need the size of India. What it needs, furthermore, is really a much more national effort, which India is much more regionalized than, say, China, right? And in a democracy, that's very difficult as well. And that's why it needs to push through a lot of reforms, land reforms, labor reforms. And I think this is the moment to do it. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of these roadblocks, so India's domestic development, can be pushed through by outside forces. A good example is that India itself will find it very difficult to lower duties without using the U.S. as an excuse to push it lower, to expose the Indian companies through much more competition, right? By lowering tariffs, it can also raise the subsidies level and other support, such as lending support. So there are many other ways in which India can support domestic companies. At our tariffs in the hundreds of level, I think there's room to be lower further, to say to a much lower level at the 50% level, which is quite high, for example. So I do think that there's leeways for India to give wins to the U.S., and there's also non-tariff barriers. But fundamentally, given the fact that India is such a high tariff country, and not only that, it is just basically symptomatic of the bureaucracy that's gone too big, and I think tariff is just symptomatic of it. There's much more rooms in which things can go further, and I think, as you mentioned, India before never looked outward for growth, and now it is, and it's not too late. I do think that India can catch wins. These challenges are huge opportunities. Everyone is trying to dodge geopolitical risk and friction to trade. And what India does offer is that it's much further away from China than the rest of the Southeast Asian countries.